What if the country that got hit the hardest still came out with the better deal? That sounds absurd, but that is exactly why this story matters. Most people look at this conflict and see bombs, destroyed facilities, lost commanders, burned missiles, and cities full of fear. Then they hear Iranian leaders call the outcome a victory and assume it is just propaganda. But geopolitics is not scored like boxing. In finance, the winner is not always the side that takes less visible damage. Sometimes the winner is the side that makes the other side pay more for longer. That is the frame that changes everything. This rewrite is based on the script you shared earlier, because this story is not only about airstrikes or nuclear sites. It is about leverage. It is about who can shape prices, control fear, stretch the conflict, and force the other side into a more expensive future. Once you stop looking only at explosions and start looking at oil, shipping, military budgets, inflation, and political distraction, the conflict looks very different. That is the first thing most people miss. America and its allies can win a military exchange and still walk into a strategic problem that costs more than expected. Iran can lose planes, sites, and missiles, and still keep the one thing that really matters in a long conflict: the ability to make the whole system nervous. And when the whole system gets nervous, the cost does not stay in the Middle East. It moves into oil, freight, food, interest rates, government spending, and household budgets. So the real question is not who got hurt more in the short run. The real question is whose long-term goal moved closer. That is the only scoreboard that matters. America's goal was clear enough: reduce Iran's threat, weaken its military capability, limit its future room to act, and show that escalation comes with a severe price. Iran's goal was different from the start. Iran was never trying to beat America in a clean, direct, conventional war. It never needed to look stronger, plane for plane or ship for ship. Its strategy was based on endurance, pressure, and cost. Stay alive. Keep the regime standing. Keep the region unstable enough that America cannot comfortably leave. Keep stronger powers trapped in a constant cycle of response. Keep the world aware that one state with enough patience can still shake energy markets and trade routes. That is not a battlefield strategy in the old sense. That is a pressure strategy. It works like a market panic. You do not need to destroy everything. You only need to break confidence. Once confidence breaks, prices move. Once prices move, governments react. Once governments react, budgets expand. Once budgets expand, the war starts spreading into economics. And that is why this conflict fits perfectly into a finance lens. Because when missiles fly, people talk about military power. But when tankers slow down, insurers panic, and oil moves higher, suddenly everyone remembers money. The market becomes the second battlefield, and often the more painful one. Look at the first major pillar of the story: oil. If you want to understand modern power, stop staring only at the sky and start staring at the shipping lane. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the world. A huge share of global oil and gas flows through that narrow passage. That means any credible threat around it does not remain local. It becomes global almost immediately. And here is the key point: Iran does not need perfect control of that route to create fear. It only needs enough danger to make ship owners hesitate. Insurers raise premiums, traders push prices higher, and governments start talking about emergency measures. That is how a weaker military actor can still hit the world economy. Not by matching the stronger side weapon for weapon, but by threatening the artery that feeds the global system. That is real leverage. One side spends billions on aircraft, carriers, interceptors, logistics, bases, and diplomacy. The other side threatens one narrow waterway, and suddenly the market starts doing math. That is not symmetry. That is asymmetry. And asymmetry is where smaller powers find room to breathe. Think about how fast the chain reaction works. Oil rises, transport costs rise, shipping prices rise, airline costs rise, input prices for factories rise, inflation becomes harder to control, central banks lose room, governments face new pressure, families feel it at the pump and in the grocery aisle. A regional conflict becomes a household problem. That is how the price of fear travels. This is why market reaction matters more than victory speeches. Leaders can go on television and declare success, but the market reveals what investors actually believe. If crude moves sharply higher, if shipping gets riskier, if emergency reserve talk begins, then the market is telling you the conflict is still alive inside the system. The bombs may have stopped for a moment, but the financial consequences have not. That alone would make this story serious. But the second pillar goes deeper. Iran's real strength has never been in winning a short, clean war. Its strength has been in keeping stronger powers tied down. That is the long game. Not total victory, not dramatic conquest, strategic friction. America wants freedom of movement. Iran wants to make movement costly. America wants to shift attention to the future. Iran wants to drag attention back into the present. America wants regional stability at a manageable cost. Iran wants to prove that the region can still impose a premium on calm. Every time the United States has to add ships, missile defense, emergency diplomacy, fresh deployments, or new security spending, Iran is scoring in its own way. Not because it looks stronger, but because it is forcing the stronger power into a more expensive posture. That is the trap. A country can be more powerful and still be pulled into a worse cost structure. And cost structure matters. Carrier groups are not free. Interceptors are not free. Keeping regional bases ready is not free. Replacing destroyed munitions is not free. Intelligence operations are not free. Emergency military movement is not free. Long-running deterrence is never free. Every extra month of tension becomes a budget line. Every new flare-up becomes another bill. This is where geopolitics starts sounding like finance again. A state can absorb major direct pain if it can impose a longer stream of cost on a richer rival. The richer rival may still be stronger in every visible category, but it is now paying rent on instability. That is not a cinematic victory. It is a strategic burden. And burdens add up. Great powers do not always lose through direct defeat. Sometimes they lose through exhaustion, distraction, and the slow loss of flexibility. A country can dominate in a strike and still inherit a worse map afterward. It can destroy targets and still end up more committed, more stretched, and more financially exposed than before. That is why this story is dangerous for America in economic terms. The cost is not just the strike itself. The cost is the open tab after the strike. War starts with speeches and flags, but sooner or later, the invoice arrives. And the invoice does not care who sounded confident on television. The third pillar is the part many people resist emotionally. How can a country lose so much and still claim it achieved something? Because heavy damage and strategic defeat are not always the same thing. That is the lesson people hate, but it is true. A country can be hurt badly and still come out with more room in the next phase if the conflict changes the political frame. For Iran, the path was never to look untouched. That was impossible. The path was to take the hit, survive it, and turn survival into proof of endurance. If the regime remains standing, that matters. If the state avoids collapse, that matters. If it can still threaten escalation, that matters. If it can still influence the energy market, that matters. If it emerges with weaker outside control over its future decisions, that matters too. That is why survival is not a minor detail. Survival is the core of the strategy. If the leadership remains in place and the country still has enough capacity to raise the price of future escalation, then the war did not erase leverage. In some ways, it clarified it. And that message spreads. Other states watch. Investors watch. Oil traders watch. Defense planners watch. They all learn the same uncomfortable lesson. Overwhelming force does not always create a clean political result. The stronger side can hit hard and still fail to produce a stable ending. That matters far beyond one conflict. It affects future deterrence, future negotiations, future market pricing, and future risk calculations. Because markets love clean endings. Markets want clarity. But geopolitics keeps producing damaged actors with strong incentives, uncertain red lines, and unresolved choke points. That is not peace. That is suspended cost. And suspended cost can keep money nervous for a very long time. So yes, Iran may lose facilities, missiles, commanders, and economic breathing room. Yes, the internal damage can be severe. Yes, its people can absorb terrible pain. But if the result is higher global oil risk, deeper American involvement, weaker confidence in long-term containment, and a global impression that the regime survived direct pressure without collapse, then the final outcome is far more mixed than the headlines suggest. That is the real twist. A clear military win can still produce a messy strategic picture. And messy strategic pictures are exactly what financial systems hate most. So how should a smart viewer think about this? First, stop using the word win in a lazy way. In finance, outcomes are judged by flows, costs, risk, duration, and exposure. Use the same standard here. Ask what happened to energy risk. Ask what happened to shipping costs. Ask what happened to military spending. Ask whether inflation pressure became harder to control. Ask whether stronger powers gained more freedom or less. Ask whether fear became part of the price of oil. If the answer to those questions is bad, then something important shifted, even if one side lost more hardware on paper. Second, pay more attention to choke points than to slogans. Speeches matter for headlines. Choke points matter for markets. A leader saying, "Victory does not move the global system as much as a dangerous shipping lane does." Hormuz matters more than the press conference. Insurance premiums matter more than the public statement. Energy flow matters more than the slogan. Third, study second-order effects. Most people only watch the blast. Smart people study the bill that comes after the blast. Higher oil affects transport. Higher transport affects goods. Higher goods prices affect inflation. Inflation affects rates. Rates affect loans, jobs, housing, equity markets, and political pressure. That is how a war far away can step into everyday life. Fourth, understand the long game. Iran's strategic power does not come from looking stronger in a classic military comparison. It comes from making confrontation costly, messy, extended, and hard to conclude cleanly. That means every flare-up is not just a military event. It is a pricing event. It can change the cost of energy, the cost of security, the cost of transport, and the cost of confidence. Fifth, remember that modern conflict is increasingly economic even when it starts militarily. The missile is often only the opening line. The long chapter is written in prices, budgets, insurance, market nerves, and political strain. That is why the finance angle is not a side story. It is the main story. So who actually came out ahead? The honest answer is that the battlefield and the financial scoreboard may be telling two different stories. One side may have landed the harder blow. The other side may have succeeded in raising the cost of the entire system. One side may have looked dominant in the strike window. The other may have improved its long-term ability to create risk, fear, and expense. And in a world built on oil flows, trade routes, debt, inflation, and fragile confidence, that can be enough to change the outcome. Because in the end, victory in modern geopolitics is not only about what you destroy, it is about what you force the other side to carry after the destruction is over. If you can survive, keep leverage alive, and make the stronger side pay more for longer, then even a damaged country can still shape the future. That is the part most people miss. And that is why this story is bigger than one ceasefire, one exchange, or one headline. It is about the real cost of conflict in the modern age. Not just broken buildings, but broken certainty. Not just lost assets, but rising prices. Not just military moves, but financial consequences that travel across the world. So the next time you hear a leader declare victory after a brutal exchange, do not look first at the speech. Look at oil. Look at shipping. Look at defense spending. Look at inflation expectations. Look at whether the stronger side became freer or more trapped. Because that is where the truth usually hides.